In November 1999, the quiet neighborhoods of South Dallas became the stage for a morning of unimaginable tragedy. Inside a modest family home, 44-year-old Carol Hall was beginning her day. A mother focused on providing stability and safety for her children. But before that morning could unfold, the man she once allowed into her life turned her home into a scene of violence that would shock the entire city. That man was William Earl Rayford, a figure already shadowed by a violent past. Once imprisoned for taking the life of his estranged wife and released years earlier on parole, he now carried with him rejection, resentment, and the weight of choices that had never been corrected. Armed not with reason but with a need for control, Rayford forced his way back into Carol's life one final time. In the chaos that followed, her 11-year-old son was left gravely wounded, fighting for his life with a punctured lung. Carol herself fled barefoot into the cold November air, only to be caught, carried away, and hidden deep inside a drainage culvert. What unfolded was a story of betrayal from within, of a family torn apart by the very man who once shared their home. The aftermath revealed more than loss. Investigators uncovered a trail of evidence told in undeniable detail. An eyewitness account from a child. Forensic proof linking Rayford to the scene. And his own confession directing police to where Carol's body lay hidden. What followed was a capital murder trial, the resurfacing of his violent history, and a death sentence that would place him on Texas's death row for nearly 2 decades. 18 years later, in January 2018, it all ended in a quiet chamber at Huntsville prison, with Rayford's final words echoing an apology that came far too late. Welcome back to the Echo Crime Stories channel. In today's video, I will take you through the timeline of the life of William L. Rayford, a man whose violence destroyed not one, but 2 families across 2 decades. We'll begin in the mid-1980s, where a troubled marriage in Dallas turned deadly, leaving children to witness their mother's murder. From there, we'll follow Rayford's controversial early release and the years that led him to Carol Hall's doorstep. Then, we'll walk through that fateful November morning in 1999, when a hidden key, a mother's desperate flight, and an 11-year-old boy's courage collided in a tragedy that would grip South Dallas. You'll hear how investigators built an airtight case, how a courtroom fell silent when a child took the stand, and how a jury decided his fate. Finally, we'll enter the halls of death row, navigate nearly 2 decades of legal battles, and stand witness to the final moments in Huntsville's execution chamber. But before we dive in, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we bring you the most detailed true crime cases every week. Now, let's get into the story. William L. Rayford was born and raised in Dallas, Texas, in a working-class family where resources were limited and opportunities even more scarce. By most accounts, his early years weren't marked by extreme hardship, nor by any notable achievement. He was simply an ordinary young man, drifting through school and various jobs without clear direction or purpose. But behind that appearance of normalcy, there were signs that those close to him couldn't ignore. Instability. Restlessness. A quick temper that flared without warning. He struggled to hold down steady employment and found it even harder to maintain stable relationships. Friends and family members would later describe a man who seemed perpetually dissatisfied, always searching for something he could never quite name. These weren't the kinds of red flags that made headlines. They were quiet warnings, the kind that get dismissed as personality quirks or rough patches. But in hindsight, they painted the picture of someone who had never learned to manage frustration, rejection, or loss. And when those feelings eventually collided with the people closest to him, the results would be catastrophic. By the mid-1980s, William Rayford had married a woman named Gail, and together they had children. On the surface, it might have looked like the beginning of a stable family life. But what started with hope quickly unraveled into something darker. Arguments became frequent. Mistrust settled into the household like a permanent guest. And beneath it all, fear began to take root. Gail, like so many women in her position, tried to hold things together. She tried to make it work for the sake of their children. But eventually, she realized that staying was no longer an option. Summoning the courage that so many domestic violence survivors know intimately, she made the difficult decision to separate from Rayford and seek safety for herself and her children. Just days before tragedy struck, Gail took a step that should have protected her. She went to court and obtained a protective order, a legal document meant to keep Rayford away from her and the children. It was supposed to be a shield, a boundary enforced by law. But as so many families have learned, a piece of paper cannot stop a determined man with violence on his mind. In the fall of 1986, Rayford showed up at Gail's home. Their children were there, present in the house, when the confrontation began. What happened next would scar them for life. In an act of domestic violence that destroyed their family forever, Rayford lashed out. Gail was left fatally injured. The woman who had done everything right, who had followed every legal avenue available to protect herself, died anyway. And her children, innocent witnesses to their mother's murder, were left to carry that trauma for the rest of their lives. For that crime, William Rayford was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 23 years in prison. On paper, it seemed like justice had been served. Society was protected. A dangerous man was locked away. The family he had devastated could at least find some sense of security knowing he was behind bars, unable to hurt anyone else. But what came next would prove far more controversial. Despite the severity of his crime, despite the fact that he had murdered his wife in front of their children and violated a protective order in the process, William Rayford was released after serving only 8 years. Early release laws at the time made it possible, even for violent offenders, to return to the streets far earlier than their victims' families ever expected. By 1994, William Rayford was a free man once again. To the parole board, he was just another name on a list, another inmate who had served his time and earned his release. But in hindsight, that decision carried devastating consequences. Because only 5 years after regaining his freedom, Rayford would strike again. And this time, the crime scene would shock even the most seasoned investigators in Dallas. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon, because this is one Texas case you will never forget. By the late 1990s, William Rayford's life had entered what appeared to be a new chapter. He began a relationship with Carol Lynn Thomas Hall, a 44-year-old mother known by friends and family as warm, resilient, and deeply protective of her children. For nearly 3 years, Rayford lived with Carol and her kids in the Oak Cliff area of South Dallas. From the outside, the household looked like many others in the neighborhood. A blended family trying to balance work, school, and the everyday routines that fill ordinary lives. Carol worked hard to provide stability for her children. She maintained her home, kept her family fed and clothed, and did everything a dedicated mother does to create a safe environment. But beneath that surface, tension was already building. Carol's relatives would later describe her as strong, but quietly uneasy. There was something in her demeanor that suggested she wasn't entirely at peace in her own home. Her son would eventually testify in court that his mother was afraid of Rayford, an unease that grew steadily as small arguments and conflicts began turning into larger, more volatile confrontations. By the summer of 1999, Carol had reached her limit. With the support of her family, she made a decision that took courage. She asked Rayford to move out. She was taking back control of her home, her life, and her children's safety. It was a boundary that needed to be set, and she set it. But for William Rayford, this wasn't just a separation or the natural end of a relationship that wasn't working. In his mind, it was rejection all over again. An echo of the fractured marriage that had already ended in tragedy years earlier. That sense of loss, that feeling of control slipping from his hands, began to transform into something darker. Resentment. Suspicion. And eventually, a dangerous obsession. Neighbors would later recall nothing particularly unusual about the days leading up to November. Life seemed to continue as normal on their quiet street. But inside Carol's world, fear had already taken root. She had seen what Rayford was capable of before. She knew his history, knew what had happened to Gail. And now, as the calendar moved deeper into the fall of 1999, she worried about what might come next. The seeds of disaster had been planted. And within months, that fear would prove to be tragically, horrifyingly justified. If stories like this leave you stunned, don't just scroll past. Subscribe now, because behind every statistic is a family that never saw it coming. The morning of November 16, 1999, began like any other in South Dallas. The sun was just beginning to rise over the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, still wrapped in the calm that comes before the city fully wakes. Families were starting their morning routines. Coffee brewing. Children getting ready for school. The ordinary rhythm of life moving forward. But inside Carol Hall's home, an entirely different scene was about to unfold. Around 6:30 in the morning, William Rayford entered the house. He didn't break down a door or shatter a window. He simply used a key, one that Carol didn't realize he still possessed. It was a violation that started quietly, a reminder that even when we think we've created distance and safety, someone from our past can still find a way back in. What began as an argument quickly escalated. Voices rose. The confrontation grew more heated. And then, in a moment that would change multiple lives forever, violence erupted. Carol's 11-year-old son, Benjamin, heard the commotion from his bedroom. Like any child who loves his mother, he rushed to help. He didn't think about his own safety. He didn't calculate the risk. He simply ran toward the sound of his mother in distress, hoping somehow he could make it stop. But Benjamin was met with violence that no child should ever face. In the chaos, he was stabbed. The blade punctured his lung, and suddenly the boy who had been sleeping peacefully just minutes earlier was now gasping for breath, struggling to survive, his young body going into shock as blood filled his chest cavity. In the panic and terror of those moments, Carol made a desperate decision. She ran. Barefoot and terrified, she fled from her own home into the cold November air. Behind her, she could hear Rayford giving chase. The man she had once trusted, the man she had allowed into her life and her children's lives, was now hunting her down like prey. Carol didn't make it far. Within moments, Rayford caught up to her. He grabbed her, lifted her over his shoulder, and began carrying her away from the house, away from the street, toward the wooded area that stretched out behind the neighborhood. To anyone who might have seen them from a distance, it might have looked like a struggle between two adults, a domestic dispute playing out in the early morning light. But those who knew Carol would later describe it for what it truly was. An abduction in plain sight. Rayford carried her deep into the wooded area, far from where anyone might hear or see what was happening. And there, approximately 300 feet into a drainage culvert, hidden from view and buried in darkness, Carol Hall's life came to a violent end. The autopsy would later reveal that she had endured multiple injuries before she died. The exact details of those final moments remain known only to Rayford himself. But what is certain is that Carol fought. She fought to get away, fought to survive, fought to make it back to her children. And in the end, that fight wasn't enough. For investigators who would later find her body in that culvert, the location itself was haunting. It wasn't just that her body had been hidden. It was how far Rayford had carried her, how deep into that pipe he had gone, how deliberate the concealment had been. This wasn't a crime of passion that ended in immediate regret. This was calculated. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and took steps to cover it up. Back at the house, Benjamin lay injured, struggling to breathe, trying to process what had just happened. His testimony would later paint the most vivid and heartbreaking picture of those terrible moments. In court, he would describe the attack in simple, childlike words. He would tell the jury how he tried to save his mother, how he begged for his own life, and how he watched helplessly as Rayford carried her away. Those words, delivered by a boy who should have been worrying about homework and video games instead of murder trials, would later silence even the busiest courtroom. Rayford didn't get far. When police officers arrived on the scene, they found him in the backyard, soaked from the waist down, shivering, and with blood clearly visible on his clothing. It was the unmistakable appearance of someone who had been in the creek bed, someone who had been inside that culvert. When questioned, Rayford told officers where they could find Carol. He directed them toward the drainage pipe, toward the darkness where her body lay hidden. And when investigators shined their flashlights into that culvert, sweeping the beam slowly through 300 feet of concrete tunnel, the light finally revealed what they had dreaded most. For the neighbors who lived on that quiet street, the scene was surreal. Sirens cutting through the morning calm. Patrol cars lining the block. Crime scene tape stretching across yards where children usually played. A mother was gone. A child was gravely injured. And two other children were left with memories that no therapy would ever fully erase. What had started as a routine Tuesday morning in Dallas had become the defining tragedy of their lives. And for prosecutors preparing to build their case, it was now a matter of ensuring that William Rayford would never have the chance to do this again. When police and prosecutors began piecing together the events of that November morning, the evidence against William Rayford came into sharp focus almost immediately. This wasn't a case that would require months of investigation or complex forensic breakthroughs. The story was written clearly in blood, testimony, and Rayford's own words. At the center of the case was Benjamin, Carol Hall's young son. Despite his injuries, despite the trauma of what he had witnessed, Benjamin was able to tell investigators exactly what had happened. He provided them with a first-hand account that only someone who had been in that house could give. He described the argument between his mother and Rayford. He explained how he had tried to intervene and protect her. He recounted being stabbed and struggling to breathe. And he told them how he watched, helpless and terrified, as Rayford carried his mother away toward the wooded area behind their home. His testimony gave prosecutors a timeline that was both detailed and devastating. It was the kind of eyewitness account that defense attorneys spend their careers trying to discredit, but in this case, there would be no discrediting a child who had nearly died trying to save his mother. But Benjamin's words weren't the only evidence. When officers arrested Rayford that morning, they immediately noted the condition of his clothing. His pants and shoes were wet, stained, and torn. It was obvious to anyone with investigative experience that he had been in water, that he had been crawling or moving through a confined space. Forensic testing would later confirm what everyone already suspected. The stains on his clothing included Carol's blood, linking him directly to the crime scene in a way that left no room for doubt. And then there were Rayford's own words. He didn't lawyer up immediately. He didn't refuse to cooperate. Instead, when police asked him where Carol was, he told them. He admitted that she was in the drainage culvert. He pointed officers in the right direction, essentially confessing to his involvement before prosecutors even had to build their case. That combination of evidence, an eyewitness, a confession, and forensic proof, created what investigators call an airtight case. But what elevated this from murder to capital murder, what made Rayford eligible for the death penalty under Texas law, was the sequence of events itself. Carol hadn't just been attacked inside her home. She had been chased down, physically restrained, and carried away against her will. In the eyes of the law, that was kidnapping. And under Texas statutes, when a murder is committed in the course of kidnapping, it automatically rises to the level of capital murder, the state's most serious charge and the only one that carries the possibility of execution. For prosecutors, the case was as strong as they come. They had everything they needed to convince a jury, not just that William Rayford was guilty, but that he deserved the ultimate punishment Texas could impose. Do you think prior violent convictions should mean automatic life without parole? Share your thoughts in the comments. By December 2000, just over a year after Carol Hall's murder, the case of State of Texas versus William L. Rayford was ready to be heard in a Dallas County courtroom. The trial would become a moment of reckoning, not just for Rayford, but for a community still trying to understand how such violence could erupt in their quiet neighborhood. Prosecutors came prepared with a clear and devastating argument. This, they told the jury, was no accident. This wasn't a sudden loss of control or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. This was planned. This was carried out with devastating intent. They walked the jury through the key facts that demonstrated premeditation and control. The hidden key that Rayford had kept, allowing him to enter Carol's home without her knowledge. The chase that followed when Carol tried to flee to safety. The abduction, when he physically overpowered her and carried her away from her home and children. And finally, the concealment of her body deep inside a drainage culvert, 300 feet into a dark concrete tunnel where no one would think to look. Every single step, the prosecution argued, showed choice. Every action demonstrated that Rayford knew what he was doing. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a man overwhelmed by emotion. This was calculated violence. The defense team faced an uphill battle from the start. They attempted to counter the prosecution's narrative by leaning heavily on a story of emotional turmoil. They painted Rayford as a man overwhelmed by rejection, someone unstable in his personal life and acting under immense psychological strain. But without strong medical testimony, without psychiatric experts who could convincingly explain his mental state, and without any real evidence to support the claim that he wasn't in control of his actions, the argument fell short. The facts of the crime spoke louder than any narrative the defense could construct. But the moment that truly defined the trial, the moment that would stay with everyone in that courtroom for the rest of their lives, came when Benjamin took the witness stand. He was still just a child, barely into his teenage years, carrying physical scars from the stab wound that had punctured his lung and emotional scars that would last far longer. And yet, there he sat, in front of a room full of strangers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, jurors, reporters, and the man who had tried to kill him. In plain, simple words, Benjamin described what had happened that November morning. He told the jury how the argument started. How he heard his mother's voice rising in fear. How he ran from his room to help her. How he was stabbed and felt the air leave his lungs. And how he watched, unable to move, unable to help, as William Rayford carried his mother away from their home. There were no dramatic outbursts. No theatrical displays of emotion. Just a boy telling the truth about the worst day of his life. And in doing so, he brought the tragedy to life in a way that no piece of evidence, no forensic report, no crime scene photo ever could. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the most hardened legal professionals in the room felt the weight of what they had just heard. The jury didn't take long to deliberate on the charge of capital murder. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty. But the trial didn't end there. In Texas, capital murder cases have two phases. The first determines guilt. The second determines punishment. And it was during that punishment phase that prosecutors revealed something many of the jurors hadn't yet known. This was not William Rayford's first deadly act. Prosecutors brought forward the details of the 1986 case. They told the jury about Earl Rayford, about how she had been murdered in her own home despite having obtained a protective order just days earlier. They explained that Rayford's own children had been present, forced to witness their mother's death. They outlined his 23-year sentence and the fact that he had been released after serving only 8 years. The revelation was devastating. For the jurors, it painted an undeniable picture. This was a man who had been given a second chance and had wasted it in the worst possible way. This was a man who had shown, not once but twice, that when rejected by the women in his life, he responded with lethal violence. When it came time to decide whether William Rayford should spend the rest of his life in prison or be sentenced to death, the jury's answer was clear. They deliberated and returned with a unanimous decision. Death. For the second time in his life, William Rayford's violence had destroyed a family. But this time, the state of Texas vowed there would be no parole, no early release, no second chance. The only way Rayford would leave prison was in a hearse. After his sentencing, William Rayford was transferred to the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, the prison that houses all of the state's male death row inmates. Life there is unlike anywhere else. It's a world designed for isolation, control, and the slow passage of time. Inmates on death row spend 23 hours each day confined to small concrete cells, roughly 60 square feet of space that becomes their entire world. 1 hour is allowed outside in a caged recreation yard, but even that hour is solitary. There are no communal meals, no group activities, no moments of casual interaction. The isolation is deliberate, designed to prevent violence and maintain order. But it also means years, sometimes decades, of near-total silence. Rayford became known among correctional officers as a quiet prisoner. He wasn't disruptive. He didn't create problems or draw unnecessary attention to himself. He kept largely to his cell, passing the hours in whatever way death row inmates pass time. Reading, writing letters, staring at walls. Day after day. Year after year. But even among others condemned for serious crimes, Rayford's case carried a certain weight, a certain reputation. It wasn't just that he had committed murder. Many men on death row had done the same. What set his case apart was that he had turned against the people closest to him. Not once, but twice. He had destroyed families from the inside, killing women who had once trusted him, who had once shared their lives and homes with him. Meanwhile, outside those prison walls, his legal team continued their work. Petitions moved through the courts, year after year, each one challenging different aspects of his conviction and sentence. Each one hoping to delay the inevitable or, at best, overturn the death sentence entirely. In 2014, the federal district court denied his habeas petition, a legal filing that claims constitutional violations during trial or sentencing. A year later, in 2015, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals refused to grant further review. With each denial, Rayford's legal options narrowed. His sentence stood firm. And the calendar was slowly, steadily turning toward a final date. By 2018, that date was officially set. But even then, even as the execution drew near, Rayford's attorneys filed a wave of last-minute appeals, each one carefully crafted to buy more time or persuade the courts to reconsider. For more than a decade, William Rayford lived in that small cell on death row. His world reduced to steel doors, concrete walls, and the knowledge that one day, the state would come for him. The appeals dragged on. The years accumulated. But time, as it always does, was running out. As William Rayford's execution date approached in 2018, his legal team mounted one final effort to save his life. They filed multiple appeals, each arguing a different legal or constitutional issue, each hoping that somewhere in the system, a judge would find a reason to stop what was about to happen. The first appeal centered on race-based testimony that had been introduced during his original trial. Decades earlier, a defense witness had made a comment linking race to future dangerousness, suggesting that Rayford's background made him more likely to commit violence again. In a landmark Supreme Court case called Buck v. Davis, the court had ruled that such racially charged testimony was unconstitutional when introduced by the prosecution, as it violated a defendant's right to a fair trial. Rayford's attorneys argued that the same logic should apply to his case. But there was a critical difference. In Rayford's trial, the remarks hadn't come from the prosecution. They had come from his own defense team. The courts concluded that the Supreme Court precedent didn't apply when the defendant's own lawyers introduced the problematic testimony. The appeal was denied. The second argument drew on another Supreme Court decision, Williams v. Davis. That case had expanded defendants' access to federal funding for investigations into mitigating evidence, the kind of background information that might lessen a person's culpability or explain their actions in a way that could result in a lesser sentence. Rayford's legal team argued that he had been denied the chance to fully explore such evidence during his original trial. They claimed that with proper funding and investigation, they could have uncovered details about his upbringing, his mental state, and other factors that might have persuaded the jury to choose life in prison instead of death. But once again, the courts rejected the claim. They found that Rayford had been given adequate opportunity to present mitigating evidence and that his sentence was not unfair on those grounds. The final appeal raised concerns about Rayford's mental and physical health. His attorneys pointed to evidence suggesting he may have suffered brain damage as a result of lead exposure during childhood, a toxin known to affect cognitive development and impulse control. They also noted that Rayford carried a bullet fragment lodged in his body from a prior injury, and they argued that these physical factors had impaired his judgment, affected his behavior, and should have disqualified him from execution. But the courts remained unmoved. They found that even if such conditions existed, they did not rise to the level necessary to overturn his conviction or sentence. One by one, each legal argument was examined and dismissed. On the very day of his scheduled execution, January 30, 2018, Rayford's attorneys filed their final petition with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Hours passed. The clock continued its slow march toward evening. And then, the decision came down. The petition was dismissed. In a last desperate effort, his legal team turned to the United States Supreme Court, asking for an emergency stay of execution. But the nation's highest court declined to intervene. After nearly 20 years of hearings, motions, briefs, and oral arguments, after exhausting every legal avenue available under state and federal law, William Rayford had run out of options. The legal clock had finally run out. This case raises a chilling question. Should mental health and environmental factors ever outweigh accountability? Let me know what you think. As William Rayford's execution date approached in 2018, his legal team mounted one final effort to save his life. They filed multiple appeals, each arguing a different legal or constitutional issue, each hoping that somewhere in the system, a judge would find a reason to stop what was about to happen. The first appeal centered on race-based testimony that had been introduced during his original trial. Decades earlier, a defense witness had made a comment linking race to future dangerousness, suggesting that Rayford's background made him more likely to commit violence again. In a landmark Supreme Court case called Buck v. Davis, the court had ruled that such racially charged testimony was unconstitutional when introduced by the prosecution, as it violated a defendant's right to a fair trial. Rayford's attorneys argued that the same logic should apply to his case. But there was a critical difference. In Rayford's trial, the remarks hadn't come from the prosecution. They had come from his own defense team. The courts concluded that the Supreme Court precedent didn't apply when the defendant's own lawyers introduced the problematic testimony. The appeal was denied. The second argument drew on another Supreme Court decision, Williams v. Davis. That case had expanded defendants' access to federal funding for investigations into mitigating evidence, the kind of background information that might lessen a person's culpability or explain their actions in a way that could result in a lesser sentence. Rayford's legal team argued that he had been denied the chance to fully explore such evidence during his original trial. They claimed that with proper funding and investigation, they could have uncovered details about his upbringing, his mental state, and other factors that might have persuaded the jury to choose life in prison instead of death. But once again, the courts rejected the claim. They found that Rayford had been given adequate opportunity to present mitigating evidence and that his sentence was not unfair on those grounds. The final appeal raised concerns about Rayford's mental and physical health. His attorneys pointed to evidence suggesting he may have suffered brain damage as a result of lead exposure during childhood, a toxin known to affect cognitive development and impulse control. They also noted that Rayford carried a bullet fragment lodged in his body from a prior injury, and they argued that these physical factors had impaired his judgment, affected his behavior, and should have disqualified him from execution. But the courts remained unmoved. They found that even if such conditions existed, they did not rise to the level necessary to overturn his conviction or sentence. One by one, each legal argument was examined and dismissed. On the very day of his scheduled execution, January 30, 2018, Rayford's attorneys filed their final petition with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Hours passed. The clock continued its slow march toward evening. And then, the decision came down. The petition was dismissed. In a last desperate effort, his legal team turned to the United States Supreme Court, asking for an emergency stay of execution. But the nation's highest court declined to intervene. After nearly 20 years of hearings, motions, briefs, and oral arguments, After exhausting every legal avenue available under state and federal law, William Rayford had run out of options. The legal clock had finally run out. This case raises a chilling question. Should mental health and environmental factors ever outweigh accountability? Let me know what you think. On the morning of January 30, 2018, William L. Rayford was informed that this was his final day alive. At 64 years old, he had already spent nearly 2 decades confined to a cell on Texas's death row. Now, the process he had fought against for so long was finally, inevitably unfolding. At the Polunsky unit in Livingston, correctional officers prepared him for transfer. The ride from Livingston to the Walls unit in Huntsville takes less than an hour under normal circumstances. But for those making this particular journey, strapped into the back of a prison transport van, knowing exactly where they're going and why, it becomes the heaviest trip imaginable. Every man who boards that van understands it's a one-way ride. By early afternoon, Rayford arrived at the Red Brick Prison in Huntsville, a facility with a grim distinction. The Walls unit has carried out more executions than any other prison in the United States. It's a place steeped in the history of capital punishment, where hundreds of condemned inmates have spent their final hours. Inside, the routine was methodical. Paperwork was reviewed and signed. Rayford's identity was confirmed multiple times to ensure there would be no mistakes. He was offered the opportunity to meet with a spiritual advisor, a chance to seek whatever comfort faith might provide in his final hours. Whether he accepted that offer or not remains a private matter. Texas had long since ended the practice of honoring special last meal requests, a tradition that had once allowed condemned inmates to choose whatever food they wanted for their final dinner. Budget cuts and public criticism had brought that to an end years earlier. Now, like every other death row inmate in recent years, Rayford was simply served the standard prison meal, the same tray that every other inmate in the facility received that day. He ate quietly, making no apparent effort to mark the moment or treat it as anything special. As evening approached, the witnesses began to assemble. Among them were members of Carol Hall's family, people who had waited nearly 2 decades to see this sentence carried out. There were also reporters, prison officials, and the other witnesses required by law to observe and document what was about to take place. Shortly before 8 o'clock in the evening, correctional officers escorted Rayford from his holding cell into the execution chamber. The room was small, clinical, and flooded with bright fluorescent lighting. In the center sat the gurney, a padded table designed for one purpose. Rayford was guided onto it and instructed to lie down. Leather straps were secured across his chest, his arms, and his legs, ensuring he couldn't move once the process began. 4 lines were inserted into his arms, the delivery system for the drugs that would end his life. Behind a large window of reinforced glass, the witnesses sat in silence, watching every movement, every breath. Under Texas protocol, condemned inmates are given the opportunity to make a final statement. Some use those last moments to proclaim their innocence. Others remain silent. Some offer apologies. Some express anger or defiance. When asked if he had any final words, William Rayford spoke. His voice was calm, measured, without the panic or desperation one might expect. He apologized for the pain he had caused. He addressed Carol Hall's children directly, telling them that their mother didn't deserve what had happened to her. He asked for forgiveness, though he clarified that he wasn't asking for himself. He said he hoped they could forgive him for their own sake, so they could find peace and move forward with their lives. He admitted that he had been troubled by his actions for many years, that the weight of what he had done had never left him, even in the isolation of death row. And now, he said, he hoped to finally find some measure of peace himself. Then the drugs began to flow. First, a sedative to render him unconscious. Then a paralytic to stop his breathing. And finally, a chemical to stop his heart. Witnesses in the viewing room later described hearing 9 heavy, labored snores as the drugs took effect. And then, silence. No movement. No sound. Just the stillness that follows the end of a life. At 8:48 p.m. on January 30, 2018, William L. Rayford was pronounced dead. The life of a man who had destroyed 2 families, who had killed 2 women, and who had traumatized children in ways that would never fully heal, had come to its end. For Carol Hall's family, the execution brought what many describe as a measure of closure. After nearly 20 years of court hearings, appeals, legal filings, and delays, the process had finally reached its conclusion. The man who had taken Carol from them would never hurt anyone again. There was a sense of finality, a sense that justice, however delayed, had eventually arrived. But closure is not the same as healing. The execution couldn't erase the pain. It couldn't bring Carol back. It couldn't undo the trauma her children had endured or restore the years they had lost. Her family had lived through 2 decades of grief, 2 decades of reliving that November morning every time another appeal was filed, every time they had to appear in court or speak to reporters or explain to their own children why their grandmother was gone. For Benjamin, the son who had tried to save his mother and nearly died in the process, the scars were both physical and emotional. He carried the mark of that stab wound for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the morning he lost his mother. And his siblings, who had been in the house that day, carried memories that no amount of therapy would ever fully erase. The trauma was permanent, woven into the fabric of who they became. But the case left behind questions that stretched far beyond one family's grief. During his appeals, Rayford's attorneys had raised issues that continue to be fiercely debated in death penalty cases across the nation. Questions about the role of race in sentencing. Questions about mental health, childhood trauma, and environmental factors like lead exposure. Questions about whether the legal system does enough to investigate mitigating circumstances before sentencing someone to death. None of those arguments saved William Rayford. The courts found them insufficient. But they remain part of a broader conversation about how we administer justice, who deserves mercy, and what factors should matter when deciding whether someone lives or dies. The case also reignited long-standing concerns about parole systems and the effectiveness of protective orders. Carol Hall, like Gail Rayford before her, had expressed fear. She had taken steps to protect herself. Her family knew she was afraid, and they understood why. She had seen what Rayford was capable of because he had already done it once before. But all the fear in the world, all the awareness and caution, couldn't protect her when the man who had already killed once was released early and given the chance to do it again. Gail had obtained a protective order. It didn't save her. Carol had ended the relationship and asked Rayford to leave. It didn't save her either. For advocates of criminal justice reform, Rayford's case became a symbol of systemic failure. Here was a man who had murdered his wife in front of their children. A man who had violated a protective order. A man who had shown no genuine remorse or rehabilitation. And yet, after serving just 8 years of a 23-year sentence, he walked free. 5 years later, another woman was dead. The question that haunted everyone who looked closely at the case was simple but devastating. Could this have been prevented? If Rayford had served his full sentence, Carol Hall would likely still be alive today. Her children wouldn't carry the trauma of that November morning. Benjamin wouldn't have a scar on his chest. The cycle of violence that destroyed 2 families might have ended with Gail's death instead of continuing forward to claim another victim. For the state of Texas, William Rayford's execution was another chapter in its long and controversial history with capital punishment. Texas leads the nation in executions and has done so for decades. Supporters argue that the death penalty serves justice and protects society. Opponents point to cases of wrongful convictions, racial disparities, and the moral questions surrounding state-sanctioned killing. Rayford's case didn't fit neatly into the usual debates. There was no question of his guilt. The evidence was overwhelming. His own confession left no doubt. And his history of violence made it difficult to argue that he deserved leniency. For Carol Hall's family, the execution wasn't about politics or philosophy. It was simply the end of a long, painful chapter. The end of wondering when it would finally be over. The end of worrying that somehow, some way, he might escape punishment again. But even with Rayford's death, even with justice served in the eyes of the law, one truth remained unchanged. Carol Hall was still gone. Gail Rayford was still gone. Their children still carried scars that would never fully heal. And somewhere in America, right now, there are other women living in fear of men with violent histories, men who have been released early, men who refuse to accept rejection. The system that failed Carol and Gail continues to fail others. Cases like theirs show how cycles of violence, inadequate sentences, early release policies, and protective orders that exist only on paper can combine to create tragedies that were entirely preventable. If this deep dive left you stunned, share your thoughts below. Let me be clear about something that's going to make a lot of you uncomfortable. The William L. Rayford case isn't just a story about justice served. It's a mirror reflecting everything broken in our system, and we're all too comfortable looking away from what it shows us. Everyone wants to celebrate the execution. They want closure. They want to believe that when Rayford took his last breath at 8:48 p.m. on January 30, 2018, justice finally won. But here's what nobody wants to admit. We didn't execute just William Rayford that night. We executed our own failure. Think about this. In 1986, Rayford murdered his wife Gail in front of their children despite an active protective order. The system gave him 23 years. He served 8. 8 years for killing a woman who did everything right, who followed every rule, who trusted the law to protect her. And what did we do? We put him back on the streets in 1994 like we were handing out free samples at a grocery store. 5 years later, Carol Hall is dead in a drainage culvert. Her son has a punctured lung. Her children are traumatized for life. And we act surprised? We stand in courtrooms shaking our heads, wondering how this could happen? The audacity to ask that question is almost offensive. Here's my controversial opinion. Carol Hall's blood isn't just on Rayford's hands. It's on the hands of every parole board member who signed off on his early release. It's on every legislator who wrote the laws that made it possible. It's on a society that treats protective orders like magical force fields instead of pieces of paper that violent men ignore. But let's go deeper, because this is where it gets really uncomfortable. We spent 18 years keeping Rayford alive on death row. 18 years of appeals, millions of dollars in legal costs, decades of Carol's family reliving their trauma at every hearing. For what? So we could feel morally superior about our legal process? So we could pretend we gave him every chance? Meanwhile, how many Carol Halls are sitting in their homes right now, afraid of men they've asked to leave, holding protective orders they know won't save them? How many women will die this year because someone like Rayford got out early, got a second chance, got the benefit of the doubt? We're so obsessed with the rights of convicted killers that we forget about the rights of their future victims. And yes, I said future victims, because that's exactly what Carol was. A preventable casualty of our broken parole system. Some of you are already typing angry comments. You're going to tell me about rehabilitation, about second chances, about how we can't predict the future. But here's the thing. We can predict it. Rayford showed us exactly who he was in 1986. We just chose not to believe him. The most disturbing part? This isn't even rare. How many times do we hear about violent offenders released early who go on to kill again? How many families have to bury their loved ones because someone decided a murderer deserved compassion more than public safety? And don't get me started on the protective orders. Carol was afraid. Her family knew she was afraid. Her son testified that she feared Rayford. She had every reason to based on his history. But what good is fear if the system designed to protect you is fundamentally broken? Maybe the real question isn't whether Rayford deserved to die. Maybe it's whether Carol Hall deserved to live. And if your answer is yes, then you have to ask yourself why our system valued his second chance more than her first one. We executed Rayford, and everyone feels like justice was served. But justice would have been Carol Hall celebrating her 69th birthday this year. Justice would have been her son growing up without a punctured lung and a lifetime of therapy. Justice would have been Rayford never walking free after 1986. So here are my questions for you, and I want you to really think about them before you answer. If you had the power to choose, would you rather execute one guilty man after 18 years of appeals, or prevent one innocent woman from being murdered in the first place? When a man kills his wife in front of their children, breaks a protective order, and shows zero remorse, what part of that says he deserves 8 years instead of life? And finally, how many Carol Halls have to die before we admit that our compassion for killers is killing innocent people? If someone murdered once under a protective order, served minimal time, and you had to decide whether they could live near your mother, your sister, your daughter, would you let them? If your answer is no, then why are we letting them live near someone else's? I'll wait for your answers in the comments. And I genuinely want to know, because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something I'm missing. But from where I'm standing, we executed the wrong people. We should have executed the system that made Carol Hall's murder inevitable. What do you think? Am I being too harsh, or not harsh enough? Cases like William L. Rayford's remind us that cycles of violence don't break themselves. Early release policies, protective orders that exist only on paper, and a justice system that too often values procedure over prevention can combine to create tragedies that didn't have to happen. Carol Hall and Gail Rayford deserved better. Their children deserved better. And somewhere out there right now, another family is facing the same fears, the same broken system, the same preventable danger. If this story left an impact on you, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the system failed these families? Should violent offenders ever be eligible for early release? And what would real justice have looked like in this case? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the cases that expose the cracks in our justice system. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And remember, behind every case we cover is a family that never saw it coming. Thanks for watching Echo Crime Stories. I'll see you in the next one.